This video looks at how we integrate sources, or how integration of sources is a critical response as an intertextual process. Many of you are already doing this in your autocritigraphical essays, but I want to make sure that we're unpacking this together. And I think about integrating sources as an intertextual process, kind of like an Escher print. I am a big fan of Escher's work. And you can see by some of the copies of prints here, hopefully you've seen him before, that some of his work, he's a Dutch artist from the mid-20th century, and some of his work looks at how we see things and kind of plays with how we see things, or our perspective. And I think this relates to our work in integrating sources. I pulled this quote from your engagement last week with Naming What We Know. The role of intertextuality in our writing that is always present. Whatever meaning a writer or reader makes of a particular text is not a result of their engagements with that particular text alone. Rather than existing as autonomous documents, texts always refer to other texts and rely heavily on those texts to make meaning. For teachers, recognizing that texts work in conjunction with other texts is the first step toward creating opportunities for students to engage with a wide variety of texts. For learners, recognizing that texts get their meaning from other texts is the first step toward thinking carefully and critically about how forging and reconfiguring linkages to other texts and even other contexts can shift meaning in ways both subtle and profound. So, what can we draw upon when we think about intertextuality? First, in our autocartography essays, we can integrate primary texts. Here's an example from one of my examples of autocartographical work from years ago. You'll see that I have a topic sentence here, fear is omnipresent, and then I move between O.D. Graham's story, Slackened Caprice, and Maya Angelou's poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The focus is on Graham's story, not Angelou's poem. And so I highlight in gray where I've integrated information from Angelou's poem in order to think about or to make connections between Graham's story and that work. Take a minute to read this quote here. In this integration, I'm specifically looking at secondary research from a theoretical lens, particularly Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought book, which I've talked about in an earlier video. Look at the gray highlights. You can see where I integrate this theoretical work and how I kind of move between this particular story by Owens and how my understanding of Collins' theoretical lens helps to inform my reading of that story. So this is another way to integrate intertextuality into your autocritigraphical writing. Another example from secondary research are contexts. Think about social, sociocultural, political, historical contexts that inform our thinking. Take a moment to read this sample. Now, my information here still comes from a secondary source. It is not specifically, it is from the Hochschild and Powell source, and they are engaging the census. If I was looking at the census data myself, then that would be engaging a primary source, but that still is, of course, an intertextual connection. Their commentary on this census helps me to frame my reading of Ridley's He Must Think It Out. And then this one is from a recent reading that I asked you to do by Adele Beeler. Take a second and read this again. Bueller is specifically engaging another secondary resource in order to more fully develop her argument about eco-criticism as a performance. So the last way is the way that we've been discussing in autocrittography. And remember, I've talked to most of you now individually about thinking about this as forefronting or making visible the reflections on personal experience that already inform our writing. So here's another example from my work, and you can see in the gray print, the lighter print, that this is the autocrittographical, or the reflection on personal experience and memory. And it's a little difficult to follow because it's really part of a larger piece, but I just wanted you to see how I'm kind of connecting, doing this intertextuality here. I've got Maya Angelou's poem, I've got Graham's story, and then I have this connection with this piece from autocrittography. Take a second and read through that. So what can we draw upon when I'm asking you now in this second part of autocrittographical writing in our course to begin integrating secondary sources as well as your close reading or literary analysis of Wildcard Quilt? So you could draw upon other primary texts, novels, poems, other memoirs, YA lit that you're teaching, magazine articles, etc. Anything that connects to your reading of Wildcard Quilt and helps to enrich and inform that reading. You can draw upon secondary texts, theoretical research, sociocultural context, critical responses to text, like the examples I've given you. Notice that I began this video with a reference from Naming What We Know. Feel free to start connecting your work as a teacher scholar to your work as a writer. They should be able to inform each other, not just in the discussion board posts, but also in your autocrittographical writing as it becomes appropriate, or in your discussion board posts about Naming What We Know if you want to refer to something from your autocrittographical writing. Also, other assigned secondary readings, I've given you multiple ones this week is Nash about the wilderness. Prior to that was the Bueller piece. I've also provided references throughout all of the previous instructional videos. If you look at the works cited or references engaged, or I call it different things, but usually there's a slide with a list of sources. Use one of those sources. Take a moment and look for it in the library. Oftentimes these sources are available as e-text, and you can choose a specific chapter and think about relationships between your autocrittographical work and those sources. Use your own library research using sources and references listed in the instructional videos if you want. And then also, again, those historical, sociocultural, and political research contexts, like a census result, and not necessarily someone reporting on the significance of those results, any other kind of data piece that may inform your work. And then finally, the personal experience and memory that continues to be part of your autocrittographical engagement.